The European Union is famous for its high taxes and policies of wealth redistribution. In this video, we examine wealth inequality in Europe and the strange connection between wealth redistribution and foreign direct investment. One of the most intuitive ways to evaluate wealth inequality is by examining the share of wealth held by the richest 1%. Here we've plotted this metric for the countries of the European Union, along with the US, the UK, and Norway. Averaging on a per-country basis, we find that within the EU, 24.8% of the wealth is held by the richest 1%. This is significantly lower than the US, where around 35% of wealth is held by the top 1%. Within the EU, we can find some outliers. Estonia, Hungary, and Cyprus have over 30% of wealth concentrated within the top 1% of the population. Estonia, an innovative and competitive post-Soviet country, has seen significant economic success in its tech sector, including the creation of the startup unicorn, Skype, which later sold to US-based Microsoft for a cool $8.5 billion. The higher income inequality present in Hungary can at least partially be attributed to its low tax rates. Hungary has the lowest corporate tax rate in the OECD at 9%, while its very post-Soviet flat tax of 15% on personal income keeps more money in the pockets of higher skilled and higher income earners. Another significant factor when assessing wealth inequality is Hungary's leniency in granting Hungarian passports to wealthy foreigners who can demonstrate some degree of lineage to within the historical Hungarian territories with no generational limit. And then there's Cyprus, a country famous for drawing foreign businesses and for issuing passports to wealthy foreigners. Its low corporate tax rate of 12.5%, along with its host of other tax advantages, draws a disproportionate amount of money to the small nation, especially to the pockets of those tax attorneys, accountants, and possibly government officials who help to oversee these overseas business holdings. At the other end of the extreme, we have countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, where only 13 to 15% of the nation's wealth is held by the top 1%. Finland and Slovakia also have a relative lack of the super rich, with only around 18% of the nation's wealth being held by the richest 1%. Next, we calculate a metric that will help to evaluate the extent of wealth accumulation or wealth redistribution to or from the richest 1% in the country. First, we calculate the change in the percentage of wealth held by the top 1% between the years 2022 and 2015. Then, we'll divide this by the average amount of wealth held by the top 1% over this period and multiply by 100 in order to arrive at a relative change in the percentage of wealth held by the top 1%. As mentioned previously, some of the increase in wealth held by the 1% could be a result of wealthy foreigners acquiring passports, rather than purely through internal wealth transfers within the country. This metric is presented here for all countries. Immediately, we can notice a stark difference as well as an almost uncanny symmetry. At either ends of the spectrum, we find a high proportion of countries with advantageous taxation regimes. Some could even be called tax havens. At the high wealth accumulation end, we find Hungary, Cyprus, and Malta, while at the high wealth redistribution end, we find the Netherlands, Ireland, and Luxembourg. More intuitively, there is also a high amount of wealth redistribution in Belgium. Belgium has the highest tax wedge in the European Union. For a single worker making the average salary, 53% of their income goes to taxes. Furthermore, these countries that we will examine all have one thing in common. They have all received a disproportionately high amount of foreign direct investment, or FDI. In a previous video, we explored foreign direct investment in the European Union and how it did not readily translate into significant GDP growth. From 2000 to 2023, the European Union took in a staggering $13.3 trillion in FDI, dwarfing the amounts that countries like the United States, China, and India received in the same period. A total of 31% of all FDI worldwide went to the European Union during this period. If we examine cumulative FDI as a percentage of 2023 GDP, we find that these countries had extremely high amounts of foreign direct investment relative to their GDPs, with Malta and Cyprus being the most egregious at 1,000 and 2,000% respectively. For all of these countries, the cumulative FDI relative to GDP was at least 125%. As a metric for how well this foreign capital translated into GDP growth, we calculate a capital conversion factor by plotting cumulative FDI versus GDP. The slope from the linear regression, M1, would provide insight into how well this capital was converted into GDP growth. For countries like South Korea, China, India, and the US, $1 of FDI translated into a $2, $4, or even $5 increase in GDP. For the European Union, $1 of FDI only correlated to a 58-cent increase in GDP. For countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, and Cyprus, the conversion was even lower. For the Netherlands, 11 cents, and for Cyprus, 2 cents. If we plot our wealth accumulation redistribution metric versus the log of the cumulative FDI received by each country, we arrive at an interesting pattern, a horseshoe. For cumulative FDI relative to GDP above a threshold of 125%, we find that all of these countries experienced significant swings in wealth inequality, with some acting as wealth redistributors and others as wealth accumulators. The Netherlands, which received a staggering 2.9 trillion in FDI from 2000 to 2023, roughly 22% of that received by all of the EU over that period, experienced the biggest relative shift on the wealth redistribution side. Hungary experienced the biggest relative shift on the wealth accumulation side. Of course, it's hard to draw any kind of direct causality. Tax policies, wealthy foreigners acquiring citizenships, economics, and wealth redistribution schemes are complex functions. But we can note the interesting overlap between countries that receive the largest relative sums of FDI and shifts in wealth redistribution. How much of this foreign capital was redistributed to the populace or accumulated by the top 1% is uncertain. However, we can note that this large amount of foreign capital did not necessarily lead to outsized economic growth, quite the contrary. We can give compliments to Slovenia and Slovakia. Slovenia managed to have a high capital conversion factor of 1.57, nearly 3 times greater than the European Union average, while also working to increase wealth equality. Slovakia did well also, with a capital conversion metric of 1.34, while also improving its already low wealth inequality. If we look at the Gini index, a more holistic measure of wealth inequality, we can find that Slovenia and Slovakia have the lowest wealth inequality in the entire European Union, with Czechia not far behind. Poland has had great success reducing wealth inequality over the past 2 decades, and it accomplished this through its booming manufacturing sector, giving people jobs and the dignity that comes from productive work, rather than via government handouts. If we examine Poland's manufacturing value added, MVA, from 2004 to 2021, we find a strong correlation between MVA and a decrease in wealth inequality as measured by the Gini index. China managed a similar feat. Although the Gini index is a more holistic measure of wealth inequality, it does not capture the fine details about how wealth is distributed. If we examine both the Gini index and the wealth share of the top 1%, we can gain additional insights. Here we plot the wealth share of the top 1% versus the Gini index for a fairly narrow range of Gini index values, a Gini index of 25 to 30 and then 30 to 35. We can see that the amount of wealth concentrated in the top 1% can range greatly for a given Gini index value. For the Gini 25 to 30 group, we can see that in the Netherlands, the top 1% controls only 13% of the nation's wealth, whereas in Hungary, the top 1% controls 33%, despite similar Gini index values. For the Gini 30 to 35 group in the UK, the top 1% controls 21% of the nation's wealth, whereas in Estonia, it's 35%. Despite this, the UK's Gini index is higher, 32.6, indicating a greater degree of wealth inequality compared to Estonia's 31.3. Finally, we can look at one of the kings of wealth inequality, the United States of America. Boasting a sky-high Gini index of 40.3, wealth inequality is fairly extreme in the U.S. If we include developing Asian countries, only the Philippines has a higher Gini index than the U.S. Digging deeper, we can see that in the U.S., the bottom 50% of the population only holds 2.4% of the nation's wealth, whereas the top 0.1% controls almost 14% of the nation's wealth. The top 10% of the U.S. population controls a staggering 67% of American wealth. But ultimately, everything requires balance. Systems that excessively redistribute wealth from the top 1 or 10%, from the people who often make up the bulk of high-skilled workers, innovators, entrepreneurs, and risk-takers, to the bottom 50%, run the risk of these value creators fleeing the country, taking their money and their businesses with them. If the top 1% gains an excessive amount of wealth, it can lead to oligarchy, societal destabilization, and a hollowing out of the middle classes. As always in economics, there's no free lunch. Both sides have risks and benefits. Over-reliance on state wealth redistribution can lead to the loss of individual agency and create an insidious dependency on the state, whereas excessive wealth accumulation in the top 1% can lead to the population being left dependent on the whimsy of billionaires and oligarchs. Which do you think is more dangerous?